It's always a good thing to know what you're looking at in your yard or garden. That's especially important when you're thinking about an integrated pest management system. So IPM for short, that's a toolbox of strategies to manage insect pests. But in order to manage pests, we have to know what we're looking at, what we're trying to treat, if there's even a reason to treat it. Many times, especially from our home growers, we'll get questions saying, what is this bug? I just killed a bunch of them. And then it turns out to be totally something harmless that isn't even doing damage within the garden or the landscape. So that proper identification is really important. So hopefully with this slideshow, I can kind of introduce you to a cast of 100 different characters here in the GNO area that we see very frequently. And you can take that knowledge, share it with your friends and neighbors. I know a lot of folks are posting pictures of bugs on Facebook groups, just kind of, spreading the good word that not every bug is a bad bug. Often, a lot of times, they're good bugs or they're harmless bugs. So no action is needed to be taken within the garden or the landscape. Okay, with that, we're going to jump in. Good bug, bad bug. So I did just kind of cover a little bit about why proper identification is important. Now, you don't really have to be an entomologist to learn what some of these basic insects are, what their larval or egg stages look like too, so you can recognize them that way. I really love this little cartoon. I see it a lot within entomology circles. Know your insects. It does really help when we're developing our IPM strategies within our lawns and gardens. And what I do really want, as I go through these guys, the takeaway message is some damage is fine. Most damage is fairly harmless. There's no need to panic. So it is a good idea to kind of learn these guys so you know what to do, or if you even indeed need to do anything. The proper identification of pest insects especially makes treatment more targeted. Not every insecticide at the garden center, and that goes for organic or chemical controls, conventional controls, they don't all work on every bug. So knowing the insect that you're looking at, knowing the life stage of that insect, or even like the basic genus or what family or order it belongs to, has a lot to do with what mode of action is most effective to control that insect pest. So when it comes to pest control, knowing what you're looking at, what you're dealing with is extremely important, so you don't waste product. You don't spray something that isn't going to work in the first place, and you don't waste money too, because a lot of these products have gone up in price considerably. It also helps us to protect our beneficial insects. There is a global insect decline, and a decline especially in pollinator species. So we do want to not target them. It is really a good idea to know what they look like in all life stages, so we know how to provide habitat for them, but also not spray any products around them when they're out foraging, which is typically during the daylight hours. I do want to make a note too that our gardens are a part of a larger habitat, right? Many of the gardening friends that I have, they recognize this, that our gardens are a piece of a larger puzzle. They're part of the ecosystem, and they provide ecological services, however small, and often that extends to insects. They're very small, but each garden in the city is teeming with them. Many, many, many species of them. So it's part of this larger biosystem and ecological network, even in urban areas and suburban areas, which I find very fascinating. So we're going to start off here, friend or foe. These are two of the most common guys we get questions about. They're easily confused for one another. One is a good bug, and one is a fairly bad bug. And you can see these are young because they don't have any wings. These are nymphs. So they're in their nymph stage, which I think of as their teenager stage. And they're kind of biomimicking one another. They look very, very similar, but they're indeed two different species of insect. So these are two that we see an awful lot people see in their garden. Insect number one, insect number two, take a good look at them, maybe note some of the differences, which there are. The coloration is very similar, but the morphology is very different, especially if you look at that back pair of legs. So all insects have 6 legs. That's what make them insects. In this PowerPoint, we're not going to talk about anything other than insect pests. So we're not talking about centipedes, millipedes, spiders, which are arachnids. I do have spider mites right there at the end, which is an arachnid too. People often think are a bug. But 6 legs, you know it's an insect. So take a look at these legs. Kind of different, right? And here's the IDs. That first insect is a foe. That is a leaf-footed bug nymph, and anyone who's tried to grow Creole tomatoes here in this area has encountered the adult and probably the nymph form of these guys. The second bug, insect number 2, it's a milkweed assassin bug. So it's considered beneficial in many gardens because it actually hunts other insects and can be a natural form of pest control in the garden, especially when it comes to soft-bodied insects like caterpillars, aphids. I've seen them eat leaf-footed bug nymphs, so they'll eat bug number 1. They're considered beneficial. So they look very similar, but they're somewhat different. We're going to revisit this. Here's what they look like as adults. And you can see these are not nymphs because they have wings. It's not until they hit that final stage of metamorphosis where they actually develop wings. So you can see that the leaf-footed bugs, the foes, they're kind of clustered. That's a good telltale sign that you're dealing with leaf-footed bugs. They're in the Coridae family. They're clustering even in that nymph stage. They tend to hang out in little pods or gangs, and they hang out on top of fruit often because they have piercing, sucking mouth parts. Their mouths are shaped very much like a straw, and they poke it down into that fruit and suck a lot of the juices, sugars, things like that out of there, and that's what they feed on. So they like to hang out on tomatoes. We've seen them on satsumas a lot, eggplants even. They love sunflowers. They feed on sunflower heads also. And if you look down here at the kind of the center lower photo, that is what their eggs look like. They lay them in a chain and they're somewhat boxy and rectangular shaped. So if you see this in your garden, you can actually squish it and eliminate about 30 leaf-footed bugs all at once. On the right, we have that milkweed assassin bug, who's our friend, and then that lower right-hand corner, that's another assassin bug. Same family, same order, but it's a slightly different species. It also has piercing, sucking mouth parts, but it can grab and attack other insects, and then it sucks their insides out, which is pretty cool. Here, it's actually grabbing a green stink bug, which is another pest of tomatoes. So it's doing us a favor in our garden. These guys, even when they're young, tend to be very solitary. You won't ever see them hanging out in a cluster or a gang on your plants. They kind of hang out on the top of each plant, and they survey kind of a territorial area because they're hunters, they're predatory. So in observing the behavior of these insects, you can usually tell them apart. But also that back pair of legs again, if you look at these adult leaf-footed bugs on the left, they're flared, right? Almost like bell bottoms. That's that leaf-footed part of their name. Whereas the milkweed assassin bugs are very long and skinny in that nymph stage and in the adult stage. And you can see the beginnings of that flare in the nymph stage of the leaf-footed bug. So that's how we tell them apart. Leaf-footed bugs are a form of stink bugs. We hear them called that commonly in the area. The damage looks identical. When they're feeding on your tomatoes or your satsumas, your citrus fruits, they actually transmit a yeast with their mouth parts. That's why if you've ever cut into a tomato this time of year in New Orleans, it's kind of mealy on the inside. There's green sections, it's kind of mottled. That's that yeast that they're vectoring into the fruit as they're feeding. That yeast is fairly harmless. The fruit is still edible, but it's not saleable if your goal is to sell at the farmer's market or wholesale grocery account, something like that. Typically, produce buyers will reject fruit like this. It can also make the fruit rot prematurely. So if you've ever gone to pick a tomato and it's been rotted on the vine, even though it looks perfectly fine on the outside, sometimes that's attributed to these guys, the leaf-footed bugs. Very, very difficult to deal with. A lot of our commonly used garden pesticides do not work on these. So the best strategy to control them would be to get a cup of soapy water with some dish soap mixed into it and just knock them off into it. They're not very agile. We also have some school gardens that use the handheld dust buster vacuums to suck them off the plants. That's one way to deal with them. And then just kind of giving up on tomatoes for the summer. So planting early or planting in that fall season, taking the hot months off while they complete their life cycle. That would be another IPM strategy to deal with leaf-footed bugs. Here's another one in that same family. This is the wheel bug. And I really like this picture because you can see its mouth parts, right? So we're moving into our presentation and I've got them broken into the insect orders. This is something you can look at. Remember, all living beings are classified into kingdom, phylum, class, species, and order. So this is the order that they belong to, hemipterans, true bugs. So these are the true bugs, and you'll see most of our insect pests come from the hemipterans, the true bug family, and the lepidopterans, which include the butterflies and the moths. So this is the wheel bug. It's very similar to an assassin bug. We see this one pop up from time to time in our gardens here in New Orleans, and it's big. And if you try to pick it up, it will sometimes pierce you with its mouth parts, which stings. So this is a guy you want to give a healthy, respectful distance to, but it is considered a good bug, especially very good at cleaning up things like armyworms, sod webworms, tomato hornworms. It likes to feed on those soft-bodied caterpillar pests, so that's a good guy. Some other things in the same order. Stink bugs can be friends or foes, and I'll give you some tools to tell the good guys apart from the bad guys. These are our three common bad guys in the area. The marmorated stink bug, it's a huge pest in soybean fields, but it can also be a pest in our gardens as well. This is what their eggs all look like. They're kind of clustered in a hexagon form. We also have the southern green stink bug. It's a slightly larger stink bug. It's got an emerald green color to it. You can see the nymph kind of in that center photo. And then we've got the brown stink bug as well. So those are our common ones. And again, here are their eggs. And these are really beautiful, but if you do see them clustered in this way, where it's in that hexagon shape, they can be green, they can be brown, they can be clear to camouflage them. And then some of them are carrying this kind of banded appearance as well. Very, very strange looking, but those are stink bug eggs as well. So you can control them in this stage just by squishing them with your fingers. Some of them are friends, however. Here in the South, we have several predatory stink bug species. Here's a couple of them. The most common in our area is that spined soldier bug. It looks very similar to a stink bug, but it's got kind of pointy shoulders to it. And it has piercing, sucking mouth parts as well. It's very good at aphid control. It will eat scale insects. It will eat caterpillars and anything kind of in that mite or small category of pest. And this is what their nymphs look like as well. They're a little bit more colorful than our pest stink bugs, so you can recognize them that way. Here's, remember the nymphs are kind of like small versions of the adults. So if you see this bright coloration, sometimes that can tip you off that you might be dealing with a friend and not a foe when it comes to the stink bugs. A couple other things in the same order, squash bugs. If you've tried to grow pumpkins, melons, cucumbers, anything in that cucurbit family of vegetables in New Orleans, sometimes you'll encounter these guys. They can be very destructive on our squash plants. And you see how they're clustering in their nymph phase as well. That's a giveaway that they might be a foe. And that's one thing you can do. You can take a picture of them when they're doing this. And I like to use websites such as Bug Guide. Our state arthropod museum will identify things like this also. iNaturalist is a really good resource. You can compare things to visually as a field guide almost online. But these guys are squash bugs, and they do post on our cucurbit crops. Again, very difficult to control. Even some of our super heavy-duty nuclear option insecticides like malathion, carbaryl are not very effective on these. The best way to control them are by manually removing them. So again, a cup of soapy water, squishing them, planting early or later in the season so they're not as active with their life cycles. So really putting your squash crops out there early. I'm talking mid-January, early February, trying to get a good harvest in before they're active, and then holding off to replant again in that fall season after these go dormant. Those are all good ways to control them. This is kind of a weird outlier that I would consider a harmless insect in the Coriidae family. This is Spartocera fuchsia, and this guy loves to host on black nightshade, which a lot of folks consider a weed in this area. It's a close relative to tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and flower structure looks very similar. It produces small black berries. And this bug, which doesn't really have a common name, so at work we've been calling it the Spartacus bug. It is in that Coriidae family, and it's kind of brightly colored. That's a giveaway. It might be in that family too. They cluster, and it looks very similar to a leaf-footed bug nymph in that small stage. But they do mature into a fairly good size insect. I would say about 3/4 of an inch in length. So people tend to freak out, and they hang out and congregate on that black nightshade plant. So if you have an empty lot next to your house, or maybe you're growing black nightshade in a native plant garden, you will probably see these at some point in the worm growing season, but they're harmless. Never observed any kind of agricultural or horticultural pest activity with these guys. They're just kind of interesting to look at. Here's some other common hemipterans. If you have a golden rain tree on your property or nearby, you've probably seen this golden rain tree bug. Jadera is the family. Golden rain tree is the one that makes the bright yellow flowers, and then the seed pods are kind of that hot pink color. This bug hosts on that tree. They're closely co-evolved around one another, and the insect does not damage the tree in any way. They do kind of freak people out because when they are present, they're present in very large numbers. You might see 100, 200 of these in your yard while they're active, especially during their breeding season, which is what they're doing in this photo. But this is one that I consider harmless. I've never seen any horticultural or agricultural activity with these as well. Some other ones, if you've ever been out on a walk and you've seen a cluster of what looks like spit on any plants, especially grass, they tend to like Johnson grass, things that are tall and skinny. You might have encountered the two-line spittle bug. It is inside of that protective spittle that it produces, and it's feeding on the vascular tissue of that plant, sucking the juices out of the plant. And it's got this kind of banded coloration to it. This is not considered to be a large agricultural or horticultural pest in our area. Can be more of a concern if you have a rice field or wheat, something like that, but I've never seen it cause major damage in the GNO area. It's just kind of an interesting insect. Sometimes it will show up in its adult form around our porch lights, so you might see a couple of them at once. Here's another interesting one that I would classify as harmless. This is the bordered plant bug. They do congregate as nymphs, and they have kind of this beautiful blue, steely color to them. And I see these more in natural areas than gardens, but they do occasionally pop up in people's yards. It's a black true bug with a border of red all around it. This is one that I also have not observed a lot of damage with either, so it's considered to be a harmless insect in our area. Bordered plant bug. So hemipterans do include an awful lot of different things. A lot of folks don't realize scale insects, aphids, and mealybugs belong to the true bug family, but they also have piercing, sucking mouthparts. And in their nymph phase or their crawler phase, before they become immobile, in the case of the scale, they do resemble a lot of similar attributes to one another. Cicadas are also in this order, as well as plant hoppers. Cicadas are harmless. A lot of times folks will get all excited about the mega hatches every 14 years because they do live underground for a long time. Before they come up out of the ground, they'll actually shed their nymph exoskeleton. So you find those, they're kind of briny, crunchy, usually hanging on to bark or your porch or something like that. And then they buzz up in the trees, they mate, they complete their life cycle, and then they die. So they're considered very, very harmless. They do feed on the vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem of the plants below ground, particularly trees, but not in significant ways where they cause any harm. Aphids are one that we get a lot of questions about. Up in the upper right-hand corner is the oleander aphid. That's probably the one that folks get the most confused about, especially if you're growing milkweed. It is an insect, and I'll get more into milkweed because milkweed's its own fascinating ecosystem. But it is an insect that feeds on that milkweed. It's got that bright yellow coloration. Its other host is the oleander shrub, which is very common around town. However, even when there's a lot of these present, they're usually not going to kill the plant, and they're easy to control without the use of herbicide or insecticides. You can wash them off, blast them off with a hose, and they're so small that they don't come back. When the adults are ready to reproduce, they are winged, and you can actually see that in this photo, but by and large, most of them do not have wings. I do want to point out the big guy here in the bottom right-hand corner. That's a plant hopper, and this is probably our worst one in the area. This is the Asian citrus psyllid, and it is an issue because it's an invasive species. It's a fairly new arrival to our area, and it vectors a disease to our citrus trees as it feeds. So as it's sucking the juices out of the trees, it's actually allowing a virus, or not a virus, a bacterium into the tree called citrus greening. And it causes the tree to slowly die over time. This has become a global problem as this insect has spread around the world, and it just made its way into California a number of years ago. And it's really caused the decline of the citrus industry worldwide. So that's being caused by an insect, even though it's a disease, a plant pathology problem. It's vectored by this insect. These guys are usually about 1/4 of an inch long. You usually see quite a few of them on your citrus trees at once, and they tend to sit at a 45-degree angle compared to the leaf or the stem that they're feeding on. So they kind of have their tail end up in the air. That's how you can identify them. If you see these, you do want to use kind of a high-octane protective insecticide to control them. And we have a lot of suggestions on our website, lsuagcenter.com. And then the Louisiana Department of Ag and Forestry also has some suggestions. So that's a pretty detrimental one in this area. The issue is it makes the fruit lopsided and inedible. It becomes so bitter that your mouth puckers up, and not in a good way. And the leaves become mottled of the citrus tree. It eventually does cause the decline of the tree. So this is a huge issue, started in Plaquemines Parish, but now I primarily see these guys feeding on backyard citrus in Jefferson and Orleans Parish. By and large, a lot of our commercial citrus farms are spraying preventatively for these. But they are somewhat difficult to control, and it only takes them about 8 minutes of feeding activity to vector that disease between their guts into the actual tree. Once it's in the tree, there's no cure. Here's another beautiful one, harlequin bug. And on the right, you can see those really interesting looking eggs and the nymphs hatching out of them. If you have any lingering brassica crops in your vegetable garden, so brassicas include Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, collard greens, anything like that, broccoli, these guys host on those. So it's really hard to grow things like mustard greens or collards, broccoli, not only because of the heat in New Orleans during the summer months, but because you will end up with hundreds of these harlequin bugs just decimating those plants and turning them into lace. The best course of action for these is to pull those plants for the summer and replant in the fall. You can actually start your transplants next month in August, plant your transplants in September. And what that does is these insects aren't even active during that time. Those plants prefer the cooler weather. They are less stressed, less susceptible to pests for that reason. But also these harlequin bugs have completed their life cycle for the year and are laying dormant. So they're not going to be a problem during that cool season, growing season, versus trying to push them through the summer months. And I have seen these where there's maybe 2,000 of them on one kale plant. So it's bad news. Here's another one that really likes those brassicas, but also a lot of tender, more like ornamental plants in our gardens. So azaleas, these can be a huge pest of. The tarnished plant bug. It's very, very small, maybe a 1/3 of an inch long. And when you see them, they're typically on the undersides of the leaves. So it's important when you're out scouting, looking at your garden, trying to figure out what's damaging your plants. Take that leaf and flip it over and see if there's anybody hanging out on that underside of the leaf. Oftentimes, these guys are a tasty snack for things like birds and lizards. So they do a lot of their feeding activity and reproductive activity on the underside of the leaves or in some more protected areas of the plant. So you can miss a lot unless you turn those leaves over. If anyone's got lawns, especially coming out of that June drought, we have seen a ton of chinch bug activity here in the New Orleans area. They cause this sort of blotchy, dead patch appearance, especially in St. Augustine grass. Oftentimes it'll start where there's a little bit more heat in the environment. So next to a driveway or a sidewalk that absorbs the sunlight, heat, and energy. They really do like hot, dry weather. And they breed and feed on that grass and cause these dead areas. You can actually test for these by mixing up a bucket of soapy water with a little dish soap and pouring that on your lawn. Don't worry, it won't hurt your lawn. But these chinch bugs hate that, so they'll actually float up to the surface and you can identify them. When they're super small in their nymph stage, they have kind of a brown appearance with a band around the abdomen. And then when they're adults, when they have their actual wings, and that last instar, you can see they're actually starting to grow wings. It's kind of got an X appearance across its back, and that's how you know you have chinch bugs. There's a variety of different lawn products, including organic options at the garden centers to treat these. Oftentimes they will kind of move on, complete their life cycle, and there's enough of a stolon that's still alive from that grass that it'll actually regenerate once the chinch bugs are gone and regrow and fill in that dead patch. If you're trying to grow azaleas, sometimes, especially this time of year, the leaves will get kind of a rusty color. That's because they have been attacked earlier in the springtime by the azalea lace bug. And these are very, very small, maybe an eighth of an inch long, sort of transparent, lacy in appearance, hence the name. They feed on the underside of the leaves, and what they're doing is they're sucking the plant juices, completing their life cycle. And then as those leaves continue to grow, that damage becomes more apparent. It's called stippling. That's your key word of this slide. So it stipples the surface of that leaf. You end up with kind of this bronzy, rusty color. And once you see that, it's usually too late to do anything about this insect because it's already been there, done its damage, and gone. But you can actually treat the azaleas for the following year by spraying in the springtime, and there's organic and inorganic options for that as well. But timing is pretty key. And if you do notice this on your azaleas, I have a pretty good article about it on the Ag Center website. If you just Google azalea lace bug, it should come right up. So moving into a different order, lepidopterans and friends. This is, I think, everyone's favorite order of bugs, at least when I teach this class. We do have a very diverse array of butterflies and moths in Louisiana. This is one of ours from School Garden publication, Butterflies of Louisiana. These are a lot of them that we see in our butterfly gardens or that we plant host plants for. So many of these butterfly species are specialist feeders. So they tend to only host on one or a handful of different plant species to complete their life cycle. Their caterpillars can only eat one thing or one family of plants. So monarchs and milkweed is a pretty classic example. That black swallowtail enjoys things in the parsley family. So parsley, dill, fennel, it really likes those things. Let's see that. Sulfur butterfly tends to host on cassias and sennas. So they're considered to be specialist feeders. Whereas moths, which are by and far considered to be more of a pest in the Lepidopteran family, moths are generalist feeders. So many moth larvae or caterpillars can eat many different kinds of things, including a lot of different trees, shrubs, vegetable crops. That's why they're considered more of a pest issue in Louisiana and worldwide. So let's jump in with the classic example. Everyone loves the monarch. Unfortunately, they were just declared endangered, but not officially here in this country. There's a global auditing agency hoping to push that direction here. the best thing you can do is plant native milkweeds in your gardens. And this is a little bit of their life cycle. Very recognizable, kind of iconic black and gold colored or orangey gold colored butterfly. The caterpillars have this striped pattern that warns predators that they're toxic. You don't want to eat this. I'll taste bad. I'm bitter. That's because they're eating the latex and chemicals that are inside that milkweed as they're feeding, and that protects them from aerial predators such as birds. Lizards really don't eat them. The only major predator of these guys in the area is wasps. So you can see that the chrysalis, it turns clear when they're ready to emerge. And then that upper right hand corner, that's what the eggs look like. So you can actually check your milkweed plants for these eggs, and you can recognize them from that. But I do want to point out that milkweed is a whole ecosystem. So if you love the butterflies, you want to help save the monarchs, you have to let these guys do their thing too. It's a whole mini ecosystem dependent on one species of plant that supports all these very interesting insects. They are specialist feeders as well. They rely in some way for some part of their life cycle on that milkweed plant. And up in the upper left-hand corner is another caterpillar. And we do get these in the New Orleans area, though they're somewhat rare. That's a tussock moth, and don't worry, he doesn't sting. But often you'll get about a dozen of these on a plant. They eat the plant down to nibblings, but don't worry, it will come right back as soon as they complete their life cycle. There's those oleander aphids we talked about again. They tend to cluster at the top of the milkweed plants, and they're sucking the plant juices. But don't worry, a lot of the beneficial insects that we're going to talk about in the Coleopteran family coming up, they actually feed on these. So it's better to do nothing and attract the lady beetles and other predatory insects in to deal with them and balance the ecosystem rather than spraying or blasting them off with a hose or squishing them. Some of the other ones, milkweed assassin bug, we already talked about that. Very easily confused with that leaf-footed bug. But we also have the large and small milkweed bugs that looks very similar. We've got the red milkweed beetle. It's about a quarter of an inch long. And then we got the large swamp milkweed beetle. We do get these where they'll eat the milkweed down to the ground, but don't worry, if it's well established, it will sprout right back. These large swamp milkweed beetles can be as big as a half an inch long. And we do have them because we live in the swamp. If you notice the coloration of all of these insects, very bright. This serves as nature's warning. Do not eat me. I am full of milkweed. I am toxic. I taste bitter. Don't eat me. That's why they share that coloration, that sort of bright warning. So it's not just monarchs. You may see some of these other things on your milkweed. We have queen butterflies, which have expanded their range into the greater New Orleans area in the last few years. The range maps are in the process of being updated. We also have the viceroy, and you can see where they're circling in that picture. There's a secondary banding of black on that lower pair of wings. That's how you can tell them apart from the monarchs. They also tend to be a little bit smaller. The queens are lacking a lot of that banding that we see in the monarchs and in the viceroys. And their caterpillars look very different as well. Up in the upper left, you've got your classic monarch caterpillar. And down right below it, that is your queen butterfly. And you notice it's got a third set of feelers. So these are very, very easily confused for one another. But the rarer of the two caterpillars is that one on the bottom, the queen butterfly with the extra set. The upper picture in the middle, that is a bird poop. Nope, that's a caterpillar that looks like bird poop. That's your viceroy. And then another one that gets confused for the monarch is the black swallowtail. It's mimicking that pattern that tells predators, don't eat me, I'm bitter, I'm toxic. That's the black swallowtail in the upper right-hand corner. And there you can see the labels. So that's a really cool example of biomimicry, either mimicking one another, or in the case of the viceroy, mimicking something you wouldn't want to eat, right? Bird poop. Here's another bird poop caterpillar on the left. That's the giant swallowtail. It hosts on citrus trees and hop ash trees in our area. That's a little bit of an uncommon plant. But that's the biggest species of butterfly in our area. You may have seen the adults around, and the larvae look like bird poop. If you have an especially young citrus tree, they can defoliate it pretty good, but don't worry, it will sprout back out as soon as these guys complete their life cycle, which takes under 2 weeks. You can also move them, which is now the official recommendation of the LSU Ag Center, move these larvae to a larger citrus tree as a host plant so that they can complete their life cycle, because they are indeed pollinators and we are in a pollinator decline. So each one counts, and it's worth letting them live and complete their life cycle. Now we'll get into the stinging caterpillars. These guys are definitely not something you want to tangle with. I've heard reports of all 4 of them sending people to the hospital, causing epileptic shock or some sort of allergic reaction in people because they do carry some venom in these spines. These are the 4 in our area that you are most likely to encounter. Starting in that upper left-hand corner, that's the saddleback caterpillar, and you can see the adult moth. It's kind of a boring brown-looking moth. But the saddlebacks, I see them a lot on rose bushes. I'll see them in azaleas. Often they're so well camouflaged you don't even realize you've touched them till it's too late. Very, very painful. Down below is the Eo moth. It's that bright green one with the red and white stripe laterally down its side. It does turn into one of Louisiana's more fascinating looking moths. It's got that back pair of wings is designed to look like a pair of eyes, like owl eyes, to scare away predators. So if they feel they're being threatened, they'll open those up and try to startle you. But the caterpillar is a stinging caterpillar. We see these clustered around on various trees and shrubs in the area, especially this time of year. In the upper middle photo, that is the puss moth or stinging asp or flannel moth. It does turn into a very fuzzy, harmless looking, it doesn't sting you in its adult form, fuzzy teddy bear of a moth. They're very chubby and very furry and soft to touch. But you do not want to touch the caterpillar. The caterpillar does look a little bit like cousin it or a toupee when it's moving. Inside of that fur that looks very soft are some stinging venom spines. So you do not want to touch this. This is perhaps one of the more painful of the stinging caterpillars, and this one sends an awful lot of people to the hospital each year. Last but not least, this is probably the more common stinging caterpillar in our area, the buck moth. You see the adult moth fly around breeding in the fall once the weather cools are off around October. But in the spring, these caterpillars complete their life cycle in the oaks, and they drop down from the canopy, often onto people, sidewalks where you can step on them or pets can step on them. They tend to congregate on things like clotheslines or swing sets, which is never a good thing. And when you touch them, they do sting, and they cause a welt and a chemical burn, and they do send people to the hospital as well. So you don't want to touch any of these. With all caterpillar pests, and we're going to talk about a few more, some effective controls are organic. Some of the best controls are organic products. Bacillus thuringiensis, BT, caterpillar spray. It's actually a bacteria that they eat, and it causes them to die from the inside out. And then spinosad is the other organic one that's very effective as well. It actually causes crystals to build up in their guts, so they die. Those are both very readily available at garden centers. You just spray them wherever these guys are feeding. A lot of arborists will offer for the buck moth control, they will spray one of those 2 products into your oak trees in your yard. Sometimes they'll treat the parks or the parkways as well, different neighborhoods. To control these buck moths. That's why we don't see them quite as much as we did years ago. It's because they're being treated. Here's some other caterpillars. They're not stinging, but I did put irritating because they do cause some damage. Or in the case of the white-marked tussock moth, you can get these little hairs embedded in your skin, and it's very itchy. So that white-marked tussock moth, we see that in great numbers as well, usually on the side of buildings, or they'll be crawling up around your porch. Very interesting caterpillar. These hairs protect it from predation by birds and lizards. It turns into a kind of interesting moth as well. It's got kind of a stained glass pattern to its wings and a bright yellow body. See these a lot around City Park, Mid-City, that area. But these white marked tussock moths, they are not stinging, although some folks say they are. They actually are irritating. So these hairs are sharp enough to embed in your skin, and then they cause an itchiness. Another one we see a lot, especially where there's bush killer vine or Chiaradia japonica growing. That's the vine this time of year that's smothering everything with 5 leaflets, is the grape leaf skeletonizer. It also goes for grapes. It's right there in the name. Bunch grapes or muscadines. It makes a banded caterpillar like this. They tend to defoliate things very quickly, and the adult looks almost fly-like in appearance. Doesn't look like a traditional moth shape. Kind of a blue-black coloration, very narrow wing pattern to it. But you'll see these guys hanging out around that bush killer vine this time of year, looking for a place to lay their eggs, and then the caterpillars come through and eat a lot of the leaves. They can be a major pest, especially if you're trying to grow grapes for harvesting in your garden. Again, BT or spinosad, very effective on them. Another irritating one is the convict caterpillar or Spanish moth, and that's the one in that upper center photo. These guys love to eat crinums and spider lilies, so things in the Liliaceae family. They have a striped, hence the name convict, appearance to them. The good news about these is in their larval form, they eat the flowers and foliage of your crinums and other things in that family, but they don't eat the bulb of the plant, so it's able to regrow and bloom again. So it causes no permanent damage other than it does eat holes in flowers this time of year. I see these mostly on the West Bank, points downriver of here, but occasionally in New Orleans itself. This also turns into a very interesting moth. You can see it's that bright hot pink one with the yellow and the black coloration, and then a big fuzzy mop of black hairs on the front part to protect itself. And then in that upper right-hand corner is the unicorn caterpillar for obvious reasons. It's got almost a unicorn horn right there in the middle of its body. It turns into a boring brown moth, but this is a caterpillar I see an awful lot on roses in the area. So if you're trying to grow roses, this guy might appear. Again, BT or spinosad, they do defoliate things pretty quickly. They tend to travel in groups, and they do eat a lot. So this one you might want to think about controlling if you don't want to share your roses. Here's some more common butterflies in our area. The upper left-hand corner, that's the cloudless sulfur, hosts on sennas. That's their host plant, and their caterpillars can have this kind of bright yellow coloration or green, kind of almost a lime green, depending on what they're feeding on to kind of blend in. And then it will actually make a chrysalis that looks like a dead leaf hanging from the plant. So very well camouflaged. You have to really look for them. But that's that bright sulfur yellow colored butterfly that's everywhere. The Gulf fritillary is down in the lower left-hand corner. If you're growing maypop or passion flower in your garden, it loves to host on that. The caterpillars look like they would sting. They're the bright orange with black spikes to them. But those spikes are actually they're a trick. They're a ruse. They don't sting. And they're actually very pliable, soft, and flexible. So you can actually pet this one and it wouldn't do you any harm. But it is a way to scare potential predators away, even though it doesn't have any bite behind its bark. The other one up there is the red admiral, hosts on things like nettles, pellitory, things like that. And it looks like it would sting as well, very similar to a buck moth caterpillar in appearance, but it's another harmless one that doesn't have any teeth behind it. So here they are up close. You can see they do have wicked looking spines, but again, harmless. Getting into some bad bugs. Everyone who's grown tomatoes has seen these guys. The tobacco/tomato hornworm. It's the larval form of a sphinx moth. That's the adult right there. There's many different kinds of sphinx moths. Not all of them will attack your garden plants. There's very specialized ones in the area that will host on Loguedia or primrose out in the swamps. But I do want to point out in that lower left-hand corner, what happened to that guy? That's actually a beneficial insect attacking a detrimental insect because, again, these hornworms, they'll eat your tomatoes down to nothing, your tomato plants. They'll also go for pepper plants. That's actually a parasitic wasp larva that has built its cocoons and is emerging from within that caterpillar that it's been feeding on in its younger instars. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but that's a parasitized hornworm. So if you see that in your garden, you want to leave it. It's as good as dead anyway. It's been eaten alive from the inside out by the wasp larva. And all those little white things that look like grains of rice, those are actually their cocoons, and they'll launch out of there and start the life cycle all over again. That's a form of biological pest control. So that's very, very beneficial. You want to leave those if they look like that. Here's some more close-ups of what that looks like. And they do go for all soft-bodied caterpillars, the braconid wasp. They're so small, they're stingless as well. They're not going to harm people or pets. And they're a natural form of pest control. Here's the tomato fruit worm. These guys are a pain because they burrow down into the fruit. And of course, if you try to spray them then, it's too late. They eat the fruit from the inside out. But again, that BT or spinosad sprayed in the garden on a regular basis in the evening, again, to protect our pollinators, our foraging bees, can be effective control of the fruit worm. Here's some army worms and cutworms. These are very common in our area too. You may have seen the adult moths floating around. They have kind of a clear back pair of wings. Or if you've dug around in your garden and found these cocoons in the soil, that's what they're usually from. They'll wiggle a little when you dig them out. It's kind of creepy. But that's from the army worms or cutworms. They tend to feed at the base of plants, so you do want to spray your caterpillar control all the way down. You can also make a sheath out of tinfoil and protect it that way as well. Here's some pickle worms. If you've ever tried to grow cucumbers, you may have encountered these guys. They're kind of almost a transparent, very small worm that gets down inside of the cucumbers and burrows its way through as it feeds. It's actually a caterpillar, and it's the larva of this pickleworm moth, which is in the upper right-hand corner, or left-hand corner. Again, any caterpillar control is going to be effective, but if you do see where your cucumbers have holes and kind of like a clear gummy appearance coming out of those holes, that's an indication you've got pickleworms. It's best to pick those right away so that they don't have a chance to pupate and complete their life cycle. You can feed them to your chickens, you can bag them up and trash them, but you wouldn't want to put them in a compost pile because they would just be able to keep going and reproduce later. Squash vine borers, this is another one. Folks don't realize it's in that Lepidopteran butterfly and moth category, but they do burrow into the base of your zucchini, your summer squash, anything in the cucurbit family, and they eat that hollow stem material, or eat into that stem material so it's hollowed out. This is what the adult looks like. Very beautiful looking moth. And if you turn the leaves over, you might find these bright orange eggs. If you see these, squish them on site. If you see where your plants are starting to wilt, even though they have plenty of water, and you've got kind of like a gummy sawdust at the base of your zucchini or your cucumber or your melon plants, chances are pretty good you got these vine borers. You can control them by netting your plants with a row cover, keeping the adults from laying their eggs in the first place, but that's not very effective because it excludes the bees and other pollinators as well. You would have to hand pollinate your flowers to get any kind of vegetable crop or fruit crop off of it. A good way to control these guys, you can slit that stem open and fish them out, rebury the stem and water it really well. It'll heal itself over. The plant will usually keep going. Or you can inject with a turkey baster or a syringe, inject a little BT or spinosad into the hollow of the stem. And as that larva is feeding on the inside, it will get controlled that way. So those are the hacks. Here's some hopping things. Orthopterans. Ortho means foot, right? So all these things are going to have big feet or hopping feet. This is the katydid, and usually we don't get questions about the adult katydid that looks like a big camouflaged grasshopper. It's considered harmless in our gardens. But we do get a lot of questions about the eggs, and that's what's there on the left. The katydids lay these sort of scale-like overlapping eggs on the edge of leaves. I've seen them on paper. I've seen them on deck boards. but they do kind of look crazy. They're harmless, so it's best to just kind of leave them be. They never do enough damage or have great enough population numbers to harm anything in our gardens. They just kind of do their thing. Here's one that will eat a lot of garden plants. If you're near a bayou or canal with a lot of vegetation, you might see these lubbers, aka if you're from down the river, the devil's horsemen. Heard that a bunch this year. They will eat a lot of different plants in our gardens. It's actually eating a holly there on the bottom picture. And anyone that's felt a holly leaf knows it's very tough and leathery. These guys don't care; they can eat it. Insecticides very ineffective on these guys. However, they are very large and slow. They can get a couple of inches long, which is very scary for an insect to us humans. And I've heard people just pick them off and squish them, or pick them off and put them in a tub of water, things like that. They can't get out of that water. Those are good ways to control these lubbers. Luckily, they're only active for a couple of months in the summertime, and they don't cause any permanent damage. But if you get a ton of them in your yard, they can cause some cosmetic damage and stress your plants if there's other things going on. So you might want to consider controlling them depending on what you're growing. Here's one that pops up in my garden in the 9th ward. This is the obscure bird grasshopper. This is one that when you startle it, it flits away kind of like a bird. And it's got a pair of antennae that are bright yellow. That's how you can identify this one. It is related to the lubber or locust, but it doesn't ever eat enough. It's a solitary feeder, not a congregate feeder. It doesn't do enough damage to warrant control in our gardens. It will eat pretty much anything. So usually when you shoo it away, it's going to land on a weed and be perfectly happy to eat the weed versus your eggplant. Here's a mole cricket. After a heavy rain, sometimes I'll see these scurrying across the sidewalk. It's a subterranean insect, and if you look at that front pair of legs, they're clawed and very strong so that this can burrow, and it feeds on plants from below. This can be a major lawn pest, but there's some organic controls and chemical controls that you can reach for in treating your lawn. I haven't really seen this in large enough numbers to warrant treating it in the GNO area, even in some more infested ones in Jefferson Parish, because we have so many natural predators. This is a big succulent piece of food for something. So it tends to get eaten before its population build up to the point where it causes a lot of harm. But again, there are control options available at most garden centers. Here's some shorthorn grasshoppers. These do show up in our gardens a lot too. They tend to be on the smaller side, maybe an inch or smaller, but they are generally harmless as well. A lot of them will eat grass seed. They'll nibble here and there, but they're not going to cause any permanent damage to anything. Moving into the coleopterans, which is the beetles. Here's our lady beetles, and I want you guys to take a note of the two younger parts of the life cycle, that alligator-looking insect and the small kind of blob down there in the lower right-hand side. Those are juvenile lady beetles, and in those forms, they still eat aphids. They're still beneficial. So often that one on the left will get calls about, people think it's a pest, but it's actually usually hanging out where the actual pest is, and it's providing some natural pest control. So that's a good guy, good bug. There's, of course, many different kinds of lady beetles. Not all of them are native to North America. For a while there, the Asian lady beetles, they were telling us to squish them or try to control them on site. It's a huge problem in the upper Midwest. However, that ship has sailed, or that cat is out of the bag. They do outcompete some of these native species, but at this point, there's no effective control for them. And things are kind of segregating out into their own niches geographically and also within the ecosystem. What is going to happen with that remains to be seen, but I did want to point out that there are many different kinds of lady beetles, native and non-native. And this is something you could really deep dive into if you want to learn more about the different kinds. Some of them are quite rare nowadays. And there's conservation movements for these rare lady beetles, just like there is for monarch butterflies. Here's another one that's very beneficial, fireflies. This very scary alien looking thing on the right-hand side is its larva. You find this in very untouched, unchemically treated areas underneath debris, sticks, leaves, things like that. Natural areas. So if you want fireflies, you do need natural areas, and they're extremely sensitive to herbicides and insecticides. And if there's any kind of mosquito abatement program, these guys are usually the first ones to die. So that's why we don't really see them in this area. But if you get into some more untouched parts of the country, more rural areas, you can find them still. Flea beetles, these are a bad guy. They love kale, love arugula, love eggplants, especially this time of year. Very difficult to control. Not a lot knocks them out. Planting early, planting late, avoiding planting in the hot season. All good strategies. Row cover, which is a gauzy kind of fabric material, can help exclude them. But when it comes to chemical controls, there's not very much that works on these. They become resistant to a lot of the higher octane things. None of the organic products have good activity or efficacy on these. So it's best to plant your things like spinach, chard, arugula in the cool season. And then once you do get them in your eggplant, don't worry, they're only attacking the leaves. The eggplants will still produce the fruit or the actual eggplant vegetable. So you usually don't need to control them this time of year. June bugs or June beetles. These are really annoying if you have a porch light on in the early summer. Pretty harmless. They don't cause any damage to our lawns or gardens. They do make a grub that hangs out in the lawn. Some people do treat their lawns to kill these grubs, which feed a little bit on the lawn, but not enough to cause any significant damage. They're more annoying than anything, but no action needs to be taken. This is also a June bug, depending on what part of the country or the state you're in. It's the green fig eater beetle. These are quite large, about 1 inch in length. They will eat on your fig trees a little bit, but not enough to cause any harm. Beautiful green iridescent color, and it's a scarab beetle. It's in that scarab family. Again, not a huge pest, just kind of something interesting to look at. Here is a pest, cucumber beetles, and we had all of them at one of my gardens this summer. The banded cucumber, the spotted cucumber, and the striped cucumber beetle. Again, very difficult to control, very similar to the flea beetles. So planting early before they start to emerge and start their life cycle is a good strategy, or waiting until they're finished at the end of summer, planting a quick second round of cucumbers before it gets too cold and doing it that way. But they do eat into the leaves, they eat on the blossoms, and they can cause a lot of damage. If you're growing potatoes, these guys sometimes pop up. This is the Colorado potato beetle. Anything with this kind of hard shell in the pest family, Coleopterans, is going to be hard to control because you spray a product on it, like even neem oil or malathion, carbaryl, things like that. A lot of that product's just going to beat up and roll right off that protective shell, right? So it's very difficult to control them in their adult form. However, when they're in that juicy kind of younger instar form without that hard shell, that hard exoskeleton like on the left, that would be the best time to control them. Or when the eggs are out, you can squish the eggs. Yeah, this one a little bit unusual, but we did see it this year. Weevils, we do get weevils in a lot of our grain or pasta sometimes in our cabinets. You have to treat for them. Sometimes there's pheromone traps, different natural sticky trap controls you can use in your cabinets. And then we have an invasive species that's relatively new called the citrus root weevil. And that's a pair of them there on the right, the male and the female. They breed in the canopy, and the larvae feed on the roots of the citrus tree, and they can cause damage and invite secondary fungal problems into the tree. So if you see these guys, they're very beautiful, very iridescent, but detrimental. So you might want to consider squishing these as well. Why are there so many insects? This is just some of them. But we are in that final stretch of this talk. I do want to remind you there's a post test for this. It will be in the chat. So once you do see that come up, please take a minute to complete it. And let's get through this last group of insects. This is going to include flies in that family, different bees, and some more beneficial wasps, things like that. So we're going to start with a beneficial. This is the lacewing. It's that small green lacy winged insect on the lower right hand corner. And then its life cycle, its younger life instars and its eggs are present here as well. They can look very similar in their young instars to that lady beetle larva, and they do eat a ton of aphids, scale insect, whiteflies, things like that. What's interesting about them is they have these little prickles all over their bodies, and to camouflage themselves, they will actually stick pieces of fluff, pieces of leaves, or even the dead pieces of the things they just ate all over their body and make almost like a linty appearance. And they walk around underneath that camouflage. Their eggs are very, very specific. They're laid on these long stalks or filaments, usually on leaves, sometimes on inorganic things like porch railings. But if you see these eggs on stalks like this, don't panic. That's a beneficial insect. That's the lacewing. Very voracious feeders, especially when it comes to the small insects. They'll eat aphids, whiteflies, scale, things like that. Praying mantis. This is a pretty controversial one too. We have the Chinese mantis in the area, and we have native species of mantids. The Chinese ones, that's usually what you purchase at the garden center if you want to buy beneficial insects. They are much bigger than our native mantises. They will actually eat the native ones. They will eat hummingbirds. They'll eat anything they can grab, and they can grab things much bigger than themselves. However, they are still considered somewhat beneficial because they do control a lot of insect pests in our gardens. But they do eat lizards and hummingbirds and things like that. If you can, when you're shopping for praying mantises to release in your garden, go for the native American species. And a lot of the insect providers are making that distinction in their catalogs. In the upper right-hand corner, if you've ever seen one of these, that's an Euthera. That's the egg sac of a mantis. So within that are hundreds of eggs, which will hatch and emerge as soon as temperatures warm up. You can actually cut this, take it home with you, put it in your garden. Word of advice, don't leave one of these in your car. If your car is shut up and the windows are closed and it gets warm enough in there, it's going to make them hatch in your car. And then you will have hundreds of baby praying mantises in your car. So don't do that. Make sure as soon as you cut it, take it home with you, put it right out there in the garden, and don't leave it indoors. Here's a southern two-line walking stick. For some reason, I see a lot of these in the upper 9th Ward and 7th Ward. They seem to like those neighborhoods. They're harmless. They kind of walk around. They eat plant detritus. That's the female there on the bottom, and the much smaller one on the back is the male. This is a very interesting, kind of startling insect to encounter. It's about 3 inches long, but again, harmless, just kind of interesting in our yards. Point out some of the more common dragonflies we see in the area. These are beneficial also. They eat mosquitoes, and then their larvae are aquatic as well and will eat mosquito larvae while they're in there. But the eastern pond hawks, we see those an awful lot. The Halloween pendant and the widow skimmer. However, there are many, many different kinds of dragonflies because we have so much water in our area. Very common to see these in our gardens. Here's a whitefly. These are very big pests, especially of houseplants. You get a lot of calls about them indoors. It is a fly, hard to control. Insecticidal soap can work. However, sticky traps are usually a better option. It's a yellow card covered in goo that they get stuck to, that they're attracted to. That can be a good way to control them. Long-legged flies, they're iridescent, tend to hang out on top of plants in our garden. These guys are harmless, but we get calls about them occasionally. It's kind of interesting and beautiful. If you have crepe myrtles or sycamore trees, you might notice these guys. These are bark lice, sometimes called tree cattle, and they're harmless as well. They're detritus feeders, so what they're doing is actually grooming and cleaning up the bark of the trees by removing any dead or decaying material, any lichens. That's what they like to eat. They don't harm the trees. They're just nature's cleanup crew. They're called tree cattle too because they're kind of fast and they herd together, and you can actually move them with your hands or make them move and herd them just like a herd of cattle. So that's a beneficial insect as well. Here's a detrimental one, relatively new kid on the block, the tawny crazy ants. These are actually out competing the fire ants. When you get them, they look like the ground is moving or alive because there's so many of them, and they will eat anything. They'll eat other insects. They'll eat baby birds right in the nest. They'll eat lizards. Just about anything protein based they can get their hands on. For some reason, they're attracted to electronics, so they will short out outlet boxes, cars. If they get into the computer, if the car's been parked in a section for too long, we're not really sure why, but they're attracted to electrical signals and electronics, and they can cause major damage within those systems. You can control these with baits. There's organic and chemical bait control products out there. The spinosad-based granular bait is very easy to find under the Amdro label. That's the one that most folks use in our area. But this is the tawny crazy ant, huge issue in our area now. And of course, it's out competing the red imported fire ant, so take that with a grain of salt. These are the guys that bite. You don't want to get into these, but again, that granular bait product where they pick it up, take it back into the nest, feed it to their young, feed it to their queen. That's a good product to use that works on these. There's a lot of wives' tales about how to get rid of these, including pouring boiling water on them, citrus oils, things like that. All it does is make them pick up and move, and then they set up shop somewhere else. It doesn't actually kill the nest or the queen in most cases. I've heard of taking shovelfuls of 2 different nests and making them fight. That's a short-term solution too. They just start picking up and making a new house somewhere else. Starting to get more reports of leafcutter ants in the area, especially in the West Bank. They're expanding their range with climate change. So these are very common in South America, Central America, Mexico, into that Rio Grande area. They've expanded into Texas. Now they're here. They do actually cut sections of leaves from our garden, take them underground, and then they farm a form of fungi on it. They don't actually eat the leaves. They eat the fungus that grows on the leaf, and that's what they feed to their larvae. So they're underground farmers, if you will. They can defoliate things pretty quickly, but not in a way where it won't leaf back out after they move on to different territory, which they always do. So not considered to be a huge garden or yard pest. Termites, right around Mother's Day, that's when we get the Formosan swarms. These are an invasive species, a huge pest. Up in that upper left is the carton nest that they build out of mud and spit within your walls or within the cavity of a dead tree. Very important to have some kind of residential termite contract, bait stations, monitoring, or treatment of your piers and foundation in place for these guys. It doesn't take them long to do a lot of damage. They came in with Army and Navy equipment after a couple of the different wars. There's, we think, 2 waves of importation. Started eating the French Quarter from the inside out while we developed treatments for them. But you can either do it yourself or get a termite contract. Very difficult to control though once they get out of hand. So prevention is key. They do make these tubes that they travel between the ground into structures. That's that lower left-hand photo. They need water access to breed and to create their nests and to keep the humidity up enough so that they can survive. They don't have an exoskeleton, so they dry out and desiccate and actually die if they don't have access to water to keep up the humidity in their nests. Often they'll make these protected mud tubes to access groundwater, or if you have like an air conditioner dripping humidity, they'll use that, or a leaky bathtub, they'll actually use that moisture to complete their life cycle and actually build their homes. So make sure if you see these tubes, pay attention. It means you've got a bigger problem behind the wall. Let's talk about yellow stinging things real quick. Bees and wasps, it's complicated. You can see a lot of these are not bees. Some of them are bees, some of them are wasps. However, not all wasps are bad. Not all bees are good. So let's talk about a little bit of the differences. Bees tend to have a very much thicker abdomen, thorax, whereas bees have a very kind of cinched in or narrow waist. So that's a good way to tell them apart. It's a very simplistic way to tell them apart, but it is pretty foolproof. If you see that slender, narrow waist, you're probably dealing with a wasp. We have European and African and hybrids of those honeybees in our area. The Africanized ones are a little more aggressive, but not to the point where you need to be afraid of them. People are keeping bees in the area quite a bit. So you'll see them in your garden foraging for pollen and nectar. And then during the summer, especially early summer, it's swarm season. And you might see masses of the bees as they follow their queen looking for a new hive or a new home, hanging for limbs or street signs, things like that. And they'll make a natural comb, which is what you see in that right-hand picture. If they can't find a suitable cavity, like a hollow tree or an attic opening, something like that, to build their nest. So they're considered good bugs in that they're one of our most efficient pollinators. They're honey producers, but also they can be bad if they get inside your walls. They'll fill up a wall full of honey, which in turn attracts other pests like cockroaches. So they can have a downside as well. We do have a lot of native bees in Louisiana, hundreds of different species, many of them ground nesting, and there's a huge diversity of them. You can see some of them are actually biomimicking wasps. However, they are actually bees. These are all very efficient pollinators as well. And when I say ground nesting, if you've ever seen something like this, chances are pretty good there's a solitary female native bee in there laying her eggs or taking care of her larva. That's her nest. So it's good to have some bare ground, some sandy sections of the yard, maybe without mulch, to encourage these guys. And they actually nest in there. Here's a leafcutter bee. Oftentimes folks growing roses will call because they get these circular damaged sections on the leaves. That's a leafcutter bee cutting those and creating its nest, which is in that upper right-hand corner. They actually make like a protective cocoon around their larva, and then it's made out of those hole punched out sections of the leaves. Very good pollinator, and don't worry, your rose will recover from this. I've never seen them actually kill a rose bush. Often they'll stamp out as many of these circles as they can, then they'll move on somewhere else. Bumblebees, mason bees, and orchard bees. These are very large, can be somewhat alarming, but usually you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone. Very good pollinators. Carpenter bees look very similar to a bumblebee. They can be somewhat detrimental, especially with wooden structures. They actually eat out their burrows into wood, often untreated wood, and you can see they lay like a chain of larvae within that cavity they're creating. This can be really frustrating to deal with if you keep plugging those holes up and they keep making new holes. They do sell a variety of repellents for carpenter bees. You can use wood putty to plug these holes back up and paint right over them. But yeah, they can be pollinator, which is good bug, and they can be detrimental as well, bad bug. So wasps, friend or foe. There's different categories, definitely. It's always a good rule of thumb if you have an allergy to give them their space. But there are some good kinds of wasps, including these parasitic wasps. You can see in the adults picture, they have a very long, looks like almost a stinger on the back end, but that's actually its ovipositor. That's what it uses to penetrate the caterpillar, or in the case of that upper right-hand corner, that's a maggot cocoon. It uses that ovipositor to stab into the material and lay its eggs. Its eggs hatch inside that other host insect. The larvae eat it from the inside out, and then it pupates in those rice-shaped cocoons. And it completes its life cycle. So these are very beneficial. Often they're very small and you'll never, ever, ever see them. Gall wasps, occasionally we get calls about these, especially on oaks and figs. That's another little wasp that is harmless, but it does make its little way into the plant tissue, creates this protective structure around itself as it feeds, and then it emerges. These are kind of weird and strange in the garden, but harmless. Potter wasps, sometimes you'll see these little pottery structures that's made by a wasp. They actually feed their larvae within that pot that they make. They'll sting and paralyze live caterpillars and stuff that pot full of them, and that's what their babies eat. You can see this one's got a couple of armyworms in its nest. So this is considered a beneficial activity, right? But if you're growing butterfly larvae, like monarchs or stuff like that, they don't see a difference between the good caterpillars and the bad caterpillars. So they might sometimes steal your good caterpillars and use them as well. So it could be good, could be bad. Paper wasps, highly aggressive, yellow jackets. You do want to avoid these guys, avoid their nests. You can remove their nests carefully. You can use a propelled insecticide like Raid. That's very popular. But a natural way to prevent these guys from nesting under your eaves is to take a brown grocery sack, stuff it with stuff so that it looks kind of like this upper left-hand corner, and make an artificial nest. These guys are highly territorial, so if you hang that on your porch, they're very unlikely to build their nest in that area because they think there's already a colony of wasps in that territory. So that's a good natural control to get rid of these. Hornets, with the quotation marks. This is a cicada killer wasp. It's not actually a hornet. A lot of folks are getting these confused with the murder hornets that you may have heard about during COVID. We don't have those here. They're on the west coast, sorry. But this very large cicada killer wasp can be confused for it. It is harmless. You'd have to get up right next to it and really harass it for it to sting or harm you. What it does is it's looking for those cicadas, and that's its main food source. Yellow jackets, definitely avoid. Very, very aggressive. They can actually sting you hundreds of times. They tend to travel in packs. Avoid at all costs. And then last but not least, spider mites, not an insect, but people do think they are insects. It's actually an arachnid. It's got 8 legs, and it makes that webby material that's very common this time of year on our plants. And then you can kind of see them crawling around in there. The web protects them from other predators. Insecticidal soap, neem, horticultural oil works well on these guys. But with all those good and bad bugs, I thought I'd end on a bad not bug.